All right, we are live. This has been a frustrating morning. As you all know, we failed multiple times. I was able to get Sarah for most of that interview. We will bring her back. But I am joined, friend of the show, Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in three parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of a changing U.S. political discourse on the geopolitical stage. Caleb, man, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you joining me. I always enjoy your commentary. You tend to be very insightful when you're giving your commentary on pretty much any subject, whether it's foreign or domestic policy. So when the election happened, my first thought was, I would love to have Caleb on to give his own analysis, especially considering you wrote the book on it. So I'm curious, from your take, why did Kamala Harris lose? Why did this country choose Donald Trump? And keep in mind, they call him Hitler, they call him a fascist, they call him supporter Nazis, they call him supporter trash. Donald Trump has been, 99 or 90 criminal indictments. He has been convicted in one. He has been convicted as a sexual abuser. He tried to overthrow the government of the United States. Like all of this stuff is on his resume. And yet he increased his vote share by over 1 million votes. And that just increased his vote share. If you look at Blacks, women, Hispanics, Arabs, all of them went to him in higher numbers than they did back in 2020. The Republican share of Congress, they got the popular vote, the largest popular vote going all the way back to 1928, I believe. Like, it may not be a landslide, but damn it, it's an impressive win. Why, with everything that's on the ledger for Trump, how did he overcome all of that in order to take power in the U.S. Election?
Well, I think that when it really got down to it, what I said in my book, which was published 4 years ago before she was the nominee, and then mysteriously got banned from Amazon the very day she became the nominee for 7 days. What I said was there was a faction among the rich and powerful that had picked Kamala Harris as their person, and they were determined to get her into office, and they would do everything they could to make sure that she became president. And at the same time, I also pointed out that Kamala Harris is not the most charismatic individual, and that the American people had the chance to vote for her in the 2020 presidential primary. They did not. They did not really appreciate her as vice president. She was the least popular vice president in history, according to some assessments. And she never really was loved by the American people. She was loved by the machine that runs the country. And people voted for Donald Trump in repudiation of that machine, which they saw Kamala Harris as the incarnation of. And I think that's how we can interpret the election results.
Basically, the establishment versus the non-establishment in the way that the people see it. And because it's funny, with all of the analysis that's been coming out, that part seems to be missed. Like, meaning they're blaming Blacks, they're blaming Hispanics, they're effectively saying Blacks and Hispanics are misogynistic. They are blaming or spiteful. That's the other part, where they would say, when they deporting your family members, don't come talking to us. What they haven't necessarily accommodated is their own fault and their own blame. And this idea that they're running in a campaign, and I agree with you, even when Hillary Clinton ran as I am the establishment. And Kamala Harris is like, I am the continuation of the establishment, basically continuity on the inside, change on the outside. And the public roundly rejected that. I guess from my point of view, they're looking at the public as being, okay, well, the public is misinformed. The public is incompetent. Well, how could anybody vote for a sexual abuser? Like, what are they missing in this? Because you have some people who say Kamala Harris ran a perfect campaign, and I think those people are out of their minds. Do they really believe that, or is that a blind spot in regards to the way the Democratic Party ran this race?
Well, I don't know. If you watched Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden, which I watched online, I was actually outside of Madison Square Garden. I was noted in the New Yorker. We had a big banner that said, "Only peace can make America great again," with Trump and Kim shaking hands. They quoted me in the New Yorker talking about Kamala Harris outside of that there with the big banner. But if you paid attention to that rally, one of the speakers was Dr. Phil. And Dr. Phil spoke at the rally and gave his endorsement to Donald Trump. And his whole speech wasn't really about politics. It was about cancel culture and bullying and the way not Trump, but Trump's supporters have been harassed, have lost family members, have lost their business, have lost their jobs for their political stance, and how that's wrong. And that was his whole speech. It was really just all about how he was supporting Trump because he sees Trump supporters being victims of bullying and cancel culture, and that's wrong. And that was his whole speech. And that shows you how, it is kind of something in the American culture. We like the underdog. And when Donald Trump got shot in the ear, I joked that he should have changed his campaign theme song to the William Tell overture, right? Because that's William Tell. He shoots the apple off the top of the kid's head, right? I mean, and it was very close. I think that at that point, the election was won for Trump because the American people, we want to vote for the underdog. We want to vote for the little guy who stands up to the establishment. And Donald Trump looked like that throughout his campaign. Kamala Harris was effectively president, and everyone knew it. I mean, Joe Biden was not running the country. And so everything that she said she could do, it was like, why didn't she do it now? Why doesn't she do it now? So she really didn't have much to run on. She couldn't present herself as a champion of the forgotten man. She couldn't present herself as somebody who was going to get in there and change things because she was already in power. Donald Trump was the underdog. They were indicting him. They were smearing him. I will say that towards the end, the media campaign against Trump got stupid. I mean, it was one thing when he was indicted. It was one thing when they had the woman who accused him in the trial and all of that. But towards the end, when they're saying things like, well, Donald Trump had a rally in Madison Square Garden. Guess who also had a rally in Madison Square Garden 80 years ago? The Nazis. I mean, it's like they're reduced to that. Or, when Donald Trump says, Liz Cheney, she's a warmonger, and I'd like to see her, on the front lines. I bet, she'll send other people to war, but she wouldn't do it. I'd like to see her, getting shot at, on the front lines. And they're saying Donald Trump calls for executing Liz Cheney. I mean, they're just getting stupid. I mean, they're just turning it into like a parody of themselves, right? I mean, it was to the point that unless you were already part of like the anti-Donald Trump, fanaticism, you were looking at the media and you're just like, are you serious? Are you serious? I mean, and it was like they were just becoming almost like a caricature of themselves. It was like maybe watching Family Guy or South Park and their impression of what a biased media report might be. So there you go.
Yeah, I saw that, and I remember flipping out when I saw that because look, over the course of the election, I really wanted Trump to hit this thing of we need to stop these wars. We're wasting money on these wars. All of these people are getting killed, and the world is organizing against us. The Democrats didn't bring that up. Like the BRICS Summit and everything else, the organization against the dollar, for them, it was completely invisible. Donald Trump did seem to be aware of it. And, he talks to Tucker. And he has a long speech and a long conversation about we need to stop these wars. We've been spending $10 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. What do we get out of this? This is wasting money and lives, et cetera. And I'm like, thank you. Finally, you hit this on the head. And they turn that to he wants to execute Liz Cheney. I flipped out over that. It's like you finally get the guy to say something right. And you don't reward him for that. You castigate him for that. And if you think about it, even when Donald Trump went to make peace with North Korea, the media's point of view was, well, he's clearly getting used. This is clearly a bad idea. Kamala Harris turns it into he's sitting and talking to dictators, missing the fact that the American public seemed to be okay with this idea of bringing down hostility. Even when you look at the polling on this stuff and they say, who do you trust on foreign policy? It ended up being Trump. So, he may not have hit it clearly on the head, but he definitely made this argument about, I'm not going to start wars, I'm going to end wars. The cabinet that he's bringing in, though, doesn't seem like it's a cabinet to end wars. It seemed like a cabinet to start wars. How much do you think the $100 million that Miriam Adelson paid him has to do with the people that he's bringing into his cabinet?
Well, I've noticed there's a bit of a consistency. Now, there's rumors about Marco Rubio, but that's not yet confirmed that he really picked Marco Rubio. And that Marco Rubio
is pushing hard against that. She is trying to take that role as State Department.
Yeah, and I think, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, both of them, they became very prominent voices in Trump's campaign. And both of them are people who have positioned themselves as anti-war voices, but are also pro-Israel, right? And that is, and I think that there's a layer of wealthy people, in Israel and in the United States who are very pro-Israel, but also don't think Russia is a big problem and are concerned with escalation with Russia. People that are close to the Netanyahu wing of Israeli politics. Israel, the politics of Israel have changed a lot in the last couple decades, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. You had a flow of people from Eastern Europe who tended to be much more right-wing and conservative, but at the same time, a lot of them were Russian-speaking. They have a TV network in Israel that is for Russian language people, Russian language speakers that is sympathetic to Russia. And I think especially when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard, right? Tulsi Gabbard is an active duty member of the U.S. military, and her whole thing is, fighting against Islamic terrorism and extremists, right? She comes out of the post 9/11 activities, and Russia is really good at fighting Islamic terrorism and extremists because they've been dealing with them for a lot longer than we have. I mean, the Chechen separatist groups that were aligned with the Nazis during World War II and all kinds of efforts against them, Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan in the 80s, and they're really, really good at tracking these extremist groups. And let's remember, Russia warned the United States about the Tsarnaev brothers before the Boston bombing. They had detected online what they were up to, and they went to the American government. They said, hey, watch out for these Tsarnaev brothers. They might be planning something. And they didn't listen to them. And we saw what happened with the Boston Marathon bombing. So Russia is really good at tracking those folks, and that there is a layer of people in the Pentagon and in the in the security agencies that are not really concerned with this regime change stuff, bringing down dictators, spreading freedom or whatever. They're more concerned with how can we keep our people safe from terrorism. And then they look at U.S. foreign policy, especially during the time when Hillary Clinton was running the State Department during Barack Obama's first term. And they say, wait a second, we're not fighting the terrorists. We're fighting the enemies of the terrorists. And that doesn't make any sense. And these Russians you're telling us to hate are really good at tracking these terrorists and sharing information about them. And that's why Tulsi Gabbard went and met with the Syrian government. She has a relationship with the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. I think that there is a layer of people within the government that are, and then they're anti-Palestinian, they're pro-Israel because they view Hamas and the Palestinians as terrorists, which I don't agree with, but that's their perspective. And I think that is a layer of the so-called deep state, if you want to call it that would be more anti-war and willing to cooperate with Russia, with the Syrian government, with India in particular. I believe Tulsi Gabbard is very sympathetic to the government of India, and at the same time, they're not thrilled about opposing Russia or opposing these various governments that fight against terrorism around the world. But at the same time, they're not pro-Palestinian. They have a kind of an anti-Islamic bias. I think there's a layer of people like that, and I think that's who Donald Trump's cabinet at this point seems to be. Now, Marco Rubio is not that by any means. So if he ends up being Secretary of State, that would obviously be an outlier. He's just a straight up neocon if there ever was one. But, I'm an older guy. I keep feeling like an old man. I'm only 36, but, I keep feeling like an old man because I remember after 9/11, right? After 9/11, every country that we're now told to hate was supporting the United States. Saddam Hussein in Iraq is like, wow, I've been fighting these al-Qaeda people for years. I support you, America. Gaddafi, you'll remember, even tortured people after 9/11. And he said, hey, I've been dealing with al-Qaeda for years. You want me to torture some people for you? We'll stop them. Bashar Assad was support. And all the countries, Cuba, Russia, all the countries around the world were supporting the United States after 9/11. and saying that we've been dealing with these extremists for years, and now maybe America will realize we should stop funding them and stop, using them to attack our enemies, and stop, fomenting these extremist groups, for our geopolitical ends. And that was the tone that the bulk of the world had after 9/11. And unfortunately, since 9/11, the United States has basically become Al-Qaeda's air force. And instead of fighting Al-Qaeda, we've fought governments that have stood in Al-Qaeda's way. And since, the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, we've gotten ISIS, we've gotten extremists. Since the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, they've gotten stronger. The Syrian civil war, the U.S. government fomented. So, I think there's a lot of people that are within the deep state that can see that's going on, and that we're not getting safer as a result of these regime change wars.
1,000% agree. I guess, but see, there's a contradiction within the context of Donald Trump and the people that he's putting out in, though. There's reporting that Donald Trump wants to pull troops out of Syria, because if you remember, as you pointed out, with the civil war that Obama fomented to overthrow the Syrian government, they decided to keep the oil. Basically, yeah, we couldn't overthrow the government, but we're just going to hunker down right here over top of the oil to deprive the Syrian government of those resources. Same thing with the wheat, right? So it's like our presence there is in order to prevent the reconciliation for Syria. The problem that Trump is going to have, though, is this is not the same world that he left. So the world that Trump left, Iran was isolated. North Korea was, at the very least, calmed down in regards to firing those attacks. You had Saudi Arabia that was at Iran's throat. That's not really the world that we have now. The BRICS nations have brought Saudi Arabia and Iran together. I mean, hell, they're having military exercises together. They are at the conference where they brought Syria back into the fold. And from the standpoint of North Korea has improved its missile capability where it can hit the United States. So if Donald Trump comes in with this notion that they're going to get Iran on behalf of Israel, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like in real terms, considering the way and the tenor of this kind of new world that he's coming into?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Barack Obama's strategy when it came to the Arab world was to polarize the Sunni countries against the Shia, Islamic Republic of Iran and Iran's allies. And that was the strategy that we saw Barack Obama do. And actually, Trump continued that strategy when he went to Saudi Arabia and spoke of creating an Arab NATO. And when he implemented the Abraham Accords, right, he got a couple of these countries in the Middle East that are Muslim countries that are aligned with Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel on the basis of Israel helping them against Iran. That was the strategy under Trump, under his first term, under Barack Obama's first term. And what we basically saw in the presidency of Joe Biden is that strategy has completely failed. It used to be that, you had Barack Hussein Obama as president of the United States. You had the Muslim countries very divided when it came to Syria, when it came to the Iran nuclear deal, when it came to everything. And now the Muslim world is totally united against Israel. And Iran is positioning itself as has a lot of respect and prestige among the entire Muslim world because they are viewed rightly as the main opponent of Israel. And everyone's looking at what Israel is doing in Gaza and is horrified by it. And Iran is the center of the resistance to that and the center of the opposition. And you have the Iran-aligned Houthi forces in the Middle East that are stopping ships and have, it's a David and Goliath story if there ever was one. These are the poorest people in one of the poorest countries in the world, but yet they're making the world economy scream and challenging Israel. And at this point, I believe they just attacked a U.S. battleship in the last couple days. And you have, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you have various forces throughout the region. Now, Donald Trump wanting to pull out of Syria. Well, first of all, the U.S. presence in Syria is completely illegal. The internationally recognized Syrian government has not ever given any permission for the U.S. military to be in Syria. So, it's completely illegal. And so then, of course, the Syrian government that is then aligned with Iran and has gotten military support from various Iranian-aligned groups. Every so often, there will be a rocket exchange between U.S. military forces in Syria and Iran-aligned groups. And the way that they portray that in American media is Iran attacked America. And it's like, wait a second, you go into somebody else's country illegally without their permission, And there's another group that is there with the permission of the government, and they exchange rocket fire. I mean, that's and if you go into somebody else's country illegally, you're there without the permission of the internationally recognized government, and somebody who is there with the government's permission, clashes with you. That's not like you're being attacked, like your sovereignty is under threat or something. And what I will say is interesting about this whole conflict, right? And this happened during the Trump administration too. When Trump, was running the White House during his first term, there were many instances where Iranian aligned forces would attack the United States, and then Trump would retaliate. We saw the murder of Qasem Soleimani, which was very much unprovoked. What you'll notice about that is that these are not situations, in Iraq and in Syria where it's like the governments are directly fighting each other. It's kind of armed groups that are given backing by somebody, and that is the nature of military confrontations in our time. William S. Lind, who was the Pentagon strategist, one of the main authors of the surge in Iraq, he wrote a piece. He talks about the concept of fourth generation warfare and how war is fought by non-state actors in our time. And that's an interesting concept. It's worth exploring, because basically great powers with nuclear weapons, if they fight each other, that spells the end of humanity. So instead, they fight each other via proxies, but these proxies are always kind of loyal to themselves, not the great powers who might be backing them or arming them at the time. They have their own agenda. And so warfare in our time is a much more complex chessboard. You're muted.
Sorry. No, you're absolutely right. And if you think about it, if you think about Syria, talking about these kind of proxy groups, if you think about Ukraine, proxy group, if you think about Taiwan, using, as battering ram against China. No, you're right. Even in South America, if you're thinking about the kill squads that were going through trying to take down the Sandinista governments, all of these were basically fascists that we were using as a battering ram. And yeah, I agree with you. We've gotten so far in regards to the capability of the weapon systems that if they go one-to-one, the world ends. And so it's almost like they've decided, all right, we can't allow this to get to the point of us fighting nation to nation. However, we can use non-nuclear proxies to do it. With one catch, Israel is a nuclear power. And so, it's like Israel is not a proxy in the context, well, it is, but it's not a proxy in the sense of a band of rebels. It's an actual government that we've armed to the teeth up to the point of having nukes. And so it's like, from their point of view, the Samson option is always on the table if they feel that their existence is at stake. Iran is going to launch True Promise 3, and they're effectively promising, look, we warned you the first time. This is not going to be a warning. We are doing this in order to basically obliterate you and send a message. What do you think? Do you think that is going to go through? Because I get the sense that countries like Russia and China are probably counseling. It's like, look, we're trying to do the economic thing. We're trying to get BRICS going. We don't necessarily want you to be involved in a larger war. Or do you think that conversation is taking place?
Well, I do think that Iran very much depends on the support that it's received from Russia and from China. And so dramatic moves that might spark a regional confrontation are going to be something that they would have to consult with Russia and China about before taking. And I think that Iran has shown amazing restraint compared to the absolute insane, the assassinations on their territory that have taken place. Any country would retaliate, and Iran will retaliate, I'm sure, but they're trying to figure out a way they can retaliate that doesn't spark a regional confrontation, which seems to be what Netanyahu is desperate for at this time. I think there is an interesting parallel because there are now rumors that the confrontation in Gaza may actually end before Trump takes office. And you'll remember that when Barack Obama was set to take office, there was a huge Israeli all-out attack on the Palestinians that went on. And it was timed very carefully so that Barack Obama, whenever he was asked about it, would say, well, there's only one president of the United States. I haven't taken office yet. And so he wouldn't comment on it. And there is some speculation that things may wrap up, before Donald Trump takes office on January 20th. And that would be interesting. And that's been in the Israeli playbook for a long time. So, no, yeah, I mean, there are different theories about what might be going on. I will say that on the one hand, Iran, it's Iran's military, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. They are directly accountable only to the supreme leader, and they are pretty solidly with Russia and China and all of that. But there is a layer within Iran's government that is very, very pro-Western, and the new president of Iran, after the death and the helicopter crash of their President Riazi, the new president has made some odd statements about Russia and Ukraine, and that he very much is kind of pandering to the more pro-U.S. or less anti-imperialist sections of the Iranian society at large, of the private sector, etc. So it's interesting to see that the Islamic Republic has been around since '79. It's the result of a popular revolution. And you have this very solid apparatus, the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij councils, the supreme leader. But in addition to that, there is a kind of a wider society there, a private sector in the economy, a lot of very wealthy people who fly back and forth between the United States and Iran quite a bit. There's a lot of people who live in Southern California, are quite wealthy, and then fly back to Iran. They've got big houses in Iran. They got big houses in Southern California, and they have a very liberal orientation, and they tend to be quite cynical and negative when it comes to the Islamic Republic. And so Iran is in kind of a weird spot. And it's a society that's being held together. It has a government that comes out of this revolution, but there are a lot of different factors there, and it also has international relationships. I believe Barack Obama's intention was to insert American influence into Iran with the nuclear deal, and set the stage for eventually destabilizing Iran and bringing down the Islamic Republic. And he failed to do that. And the hardliner faction in Iran that is more solidly anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, they are more solid than ever before, and that's a result of the failure of the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, and Joe Biden didn't go back to it either. Yeah, that's pretty wild. Because I've always made this argument that under Joe Biden, America has lost influence in the world. And part of that is because he's went with this kind of maximalist approach. Russia comes out, said they want a security deal or security arrangement, and we say, well, you don't get security arrangements. And all of this basically leads to and provokes this kind of war in Ukraine. And I would say the same thing, though. The war in Ukraine, on some level, has removed Iran and North Korea from this kind of isolated position that they had over those years. The world has fundamentally changed, and Donald Trump is going into a world that is far different than what he left. From your point of view, in regards to Netanyahu, what do you think he's trying to accomplish? Because you made the point of saying, well, he's continuing to escalate. But if you look at Israel, yes, Israel has the ability to kill a lot of people. Fair enough. They're prolific at slaughtering women and children. Winning a war is different, though. Like in Vietnam, the United States could kill a lot of people, but we lost that war. And so it's like they're still bogged down in Gaza. They're still bogged down in southern Lebanon. The bombing campaign of Beirut in order to try to either provoke a civil war or at the very least to get the government to give over the territory, that hasn't worked. If anything, that's unified the country. And now they're escalating to the point of striking Iran, meaning they're having back-to-back strikes. And it's become clear that their Iron Dome is not this infallible system, that Iran has the capability of basically cutting through their system like butter. Knowing this, meaning the moment that you're aware of this, that this larger country can effectively hit you at will and you can't stop them from doing it, this seems like a pathway to destruction, especially when you add in the economy has collapsed. You add in the number of people that have left Israel and may not come back because it's no longer a safe haven. What is the plan here? I mean, is it just greater Israel? Is it Netanyahu staying out of jail? What do you think the ultimate idea is in this? Because I heard it too, that Donald Trump told Netanyahu to get this over with before I get into office. I don't know if that's true or not. But what do you think Netanyahu is after in all of this, all of these moves that don't necessarily seem to be gaining him what he wants or gaining in what he seems to want?
Well, I think there's kind of a go for broke strategy. Go all in or go home. I mean that he needs a regional confrontation. He needs to escalate. He needs the Iranians to be the enemy. He needs Israel to have an existential crisis and feel like its right to exist is in question. And so he's willing to provoke things and push things as far as they possibly can go in order to maintain that. And that the way Netanyahu sees things is it represents what a large sector of the Israeli society thinks, but not the majority by far. And there is a layer of Israeli society that is opposed to him and opposed to the way he's going. And the second that the confrontation stops, there's going to have to be a big argument in Israel about what they want and what their future is. And when that argument happens, Netanyahu is going to lose that argument. He knows that. So the longer that he can prolong this confrontation, the rally around the flag effect, the better. Because when the confrontation ends and when they're just talking about dealing with issues in Israel, he's going to be out of power, and he realizes that. And I think at this point you can look back to what WikiLeaks revealed about the CIA's predictions about Israel, collapsing in the next 50 years. There's not support for it among the wider generations of Jewish folks around the world. There's a trend of people not moving to Israel. I mean, it used to be a really common thing that Jewish people from around the world would just migrate to Israel and live there, and that's not happening. And that, especially now with Israel being so isolated and the bombing of Gaza and all of that, I think Israel is at this point where it has to, figure out if it's a viable project even for the next 50 years. And so Netanyahu's escalation is seen in that context. It's like, we gotta put everything on the table, or else we got to go home.
I know, but no, okay, fair enough. I accept that. They're using October 7th as their 9/11 moment, where the U.S., we're going to reshape the Middle East with American power. In their mind, they're going to reshape the Middle East with American power, basically. But this seems to be, like, I don't know how you go back to October 7th, October 6th. And Israel does not seem to be safer than it was back then. By the same token, it's like you kill 40,000 kids. I don't know how you go back to some kind of normal apartheid state, open air ghetto scenario. Like, that's what I mean when I say, like, I don't know what you're reaching for. I don't know what he's trying to get. I mean, Yemen has been firing missiles in. They're still fighting in Gaza. They're trying to annex the West Bank. That was something that came out the other day with small tricks, basically saying, hey, Trump won. We're going to annex it. We're just going to take it. No pretense. They are still fighting in southern Lebanon. That hasn't necessarily changed. This notion or war aim to be able to bring people back to the north, that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Missiles are still being fired. Like, they seem to be in a far more precarious predicament now than they ever were. Where for the first time, it does seem like their existence is at stake. How do you think this ultimately resolves? I mean, do you see one person, one vote? Do you see some kind of partition? Do you see them going back, oddly enough, to some kind of normality of an apartheid state, open air ghetto? How do you view the end part to this? Because I got to be honest, I don't know how it ends.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people have asked me, Caleb, what is the answer? What is the answer to the problem facing the Palestinians, the Israel-Palestine conflict? And I wish I could give a quick answer that would solve things. But ultimately, the world is changing. And Israel came into existence as a result of the British Empire, the Balfour Declaration, and then eventually 1948, the United States, the United Nations setting them up. And that Israel is largely accountable to the Western countries that arm it and support it, et cetera. And in the developing world, Israel is not as popular. And if you go to Africa, you go to Asia, you go to Latin America, there are some exceptions. India tends to be pretty supportive of Israel. But aside from those exceptions, Israel is not very popular around the world. And there is a new economy arising in the world centered around the BRICS countries. And those are countries that are not big fans of Israel. And the West, that are big fans of Israel, their role as dominant forces in the world economy is waning. And ultimately, the future of the Palestinians depends on the rise of multipolarity and the sections of the world that don't have as much influence now, gaining them, which they are very, very much. I mean, it's happening. I mean, Africa is the future. Africa is rising. The BRICS countries are getting stronger. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative of China, Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. There's this whole new world that's emerging. And as that economic factor, and as that section of the world gets stronger, they will continue to be critical of Israel and put Israel in a position where Israel has to accommodate and deal with them. And that will lead to them having to deal with the Palestinian issue and Israel's ability to not deal with that issue and just rely on support from the West will weaken. And it's a process, and that's not an easy fix, right? Everyone wants an answer right now. That's not an easy fix. It's a process. But as the dynamics of the world change and we move toward a multipolar world, Israel will get weaker and be in a position where it has to start making concessions and compromising. And that will lead ultimately toward probably some kind of Palestinian statehood and hopefully eventually a situation where everyone living in that area has equal rights to some degree. But I don't think it's going to happen overnight, and it's going to be a gradual process.
We have about 2 minutes. How do you view, let me see, the rise of Trump, the change in the politics in Europe? I mean, for God's sake, Germany has collapsed. The government's collapsed. The French government has fundamentally collapsed with Macron not allowing the actual winners to form a government, and he's putting his own puppet in. But basically, even in the European elections, you can see this kind of trying or this attempt to change the tide, where many of the Greens and many of these, for lack of a better word, batshit crazy Greens got pushed out. And more right-wing parties, some of which were skeptical of the war, ended up in power, especially from Germany's part. Scholz is going to basically lose his job in the next election. How do you see Trump, this shift in Europe, especially as a result of the war and energy, not being able to get energy, in the context of BRICS and these other global South powers that are coming into play, meaning the world is trying to organize with this notion of multipolarity. These guys have not gotten on board, and they are still trying to hold the line with the 14% of the globe represented by the United States. How do you think that's ultimately going to shake out?
Well, I think the new right in Europe, the rise of Trump in the United States, represents there's a division among the rich and powerful in all these countries, and that you have the more powerful faction that is kind of loyal to the World Economic Forum, the European Union, NATO, the kind of international alliances that are about maintaining a global system of dominating the world, imperialism. And then you have a lot of local capitalists who are just like, hey, I just want to make money. I don't care about NATO. I don't care about dominating the world. I don't care about your agenda of spreading human rights. I just want to make money. And they're more interested and invested in the domestic economy of these countries than they are in the kind of global agenda that the ultra rich are focusing on. And, they talk about the rich versus the ultra rich. There's a good book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby that kind of examines the Vietnam War era and the assassination of Kennedy and Watergate in light of that division. Carroll Quigley, who was Bill Clinton's mentor, he talked about the Anglo-American establishment and how there's kind of this, the New England old money in the United States tends to be a bit more liberal, and most rich people in the United States tend to be conservative, and there's like a push and pull between them. And that, this is the divide. It is old money versus new money. It is the kind of globally oriented, ultra rich versus the lower levels of capital, the lower level capitalists that just kind of want to make money and are entrepreneurial rather than managerial in their outlook. And that's the division that I think is kind of defining things. The new right represents a lot of wealthy people in Germany who are like, hey, I just want to make money. I just want what's best for Germany. I'm not tied into this global thing. And we could make more money if we traded with Russia because they're right on our border. And the same with the Brexit folks, the same with the Trump folks here in the United States. It's not a perfect lining up. I mean, there's always outliers and different factors, but I view this in that light largely.
That is a great point. That is a really good point. I guess I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but you're absolutely right. This kind of these smaller economies versus these kind of larger economies where they want their bigger share or they want their fair share. I mean, even in the way they talk to each other, it's about we're equals, there's not a hegemon, et cetera, et cetera. Caleb, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate this. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties this morning, but man, I always enjoy you. The audience always loves you. So feel free to come back anytime. Caleb Maupin, he's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His book, like you said, 4 years ago now, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Caleb, where can people find you? I have it that you're on Twitter at Caleb Maupin. I just want to make sure it stays the
Real
same.
Caleb Maupin.
There we are.
Real Caleb Maupin. And I'm on calebmaupin.net, and my organization is called the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. So there you go.
Very cool. Man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. I always enjoy your take on this stuff.
Absolutely. Be in
You
touch.
have a good one.